Welcome to another edition of EverybodyHatesCleveland.com, the podcast. I have no idea what number this is. I can never remember these things, but I'm pleased to say that I'm joined by a guy who I've always talked about podcasting with. But Hayden, we've never been on air together. How's it going in Cleveland today?
It is a beautiful day in Cleveland, and I think our pre-show podcast that won't be available to listeners is a good evidence of why we should have podcasted a long time ago.
This is true. We actually, and I don't know if you remember this, about 2 years ago, we when we were both working for IBI, we played around with the idea of a podcast. Do you recall this at all? Does this?
Yeah.
Do you remember the name of said podcast when we were kind of throwing names around?
You said it. You said, oh man, you said it the other day, and I forget it already.
Weekend at Bernie's.
Yes. Weekend at Bernie's. Absolutely.
Well, so I guess we could call this the unofficial Weekend at Bernie's because guess what? It's the weekend.
And I guess I'm at Bernie's.
Well, we'll kind of leave that. Okay. Is there someone named Bernie like around where you're sitting right now? I guess that's the question.
How far is Bernie Kosar from where my location is at? That's the question.
I really hope you don't know that because that would take this podcast in a really scary direction.
I have no clue.
Oh, okay. Well, let's. We got a lot to talk about. I hope we can get some positivity out of this, but let's kind of take a status quo of where we're at with the Indians. They've lost the first two to the White Sox. I don't know how much we need to talk about that. I do want to talk a little bit about Kluber in particular, but having seen this team up close over the past couple of nights, Hayden, what are your thoughts of where they're at right now? It seems like we're treading water still. And we're sitting here 7 days away from August, and we look a lot like the team that we saw before Lindor and Urshela came. Is there hope for this team kind of in a big picture sense? There's a lot of talent there, but do you see this team taking steps forward in the next couple of months to make a run at one of those wild card spots?
Jim, this Indians team is one of the most enigmatic teams I've ever been privileged to have watched, because there's so many different pieces and there's so many different parts and problems and good things and bad things, and it makes for the most interesting puzzle in the world. And as you said, they are treading water right now. But admittedly, I've thought to myself that this next 2-game stretch against the White Sox, and of course they could sweep the Royals and make this sound silly, but I think if they get swept by the White Sox, I think that might be the time to really shake things up. I mean, if you're 6 under 5, or I think they'll be 7 under 500 if they can't win, if they lose both of these next 2 games, they'll be 7 under 500, and it'll be essentially August. I mean, it's not good. But here's the thing. The pitching staff is amongst the best in baseball. The bullpen has been somewhat effective, and the lineup has just been a mess. And it's not anybody in particular. People try to single people out. Oh, well, Michael Bourne is struggling. Oh, well, Brandon Moss is struggling. Oh, well, Carlos Santana stinks because he can't get on base. But at the same time, every night it just seems to be a little something different. The one night Kipnis has a bad night, that's the night they need him, and that's the night they lose. Or the one day that they need Brantley, he comes through. I mean, it's a crazy, crazy situation, and it's one that I just can't really put my finger on what's wrong.
Well, and that's, the interesting thing is we close in on the deadline, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But when you stop and you look at this team position by position, Gomes at catcher, Santana at first, Kipnis at second, Lindor at short, Urshela at third. You've got Brantley in left, Bourne in center, and that varies from with a platoon situation. Or you have Brantley in center, Aviles in left, and then you have Moss in right. When you go position by position, there aren't a lot of holes, and we'll talk about those in a second. But I guess that's been the frustrating thing. I mean, is it as simple as this? For years, covering this team, both for the both of us, that there's been a talk about having that big consistent bat. Is that what we're missing? Are we missing, we had Kipnis hot for a month and this team still really couldn't do a whole lot, make a whole lot of movement. We had a 7-game run. We made up some ground, but then fell right back. So I guess the question is that what's missing? Are we missing that one big consistent bat? Or is it just a matter of several guys? How about this? Is it just a matter of this team not clicking at once?
I would go with the latter rather than the former, because I think one big consistent bat is okay, and that's great if you have one big consistent bat. But at the same
also
time,
rare. It's also rare.
Yeah, exactly. First of all, it's rare. Second of all, what is the point of having one big consistent bat if you don't have guys around that bat? And the Indians would have guys around that bat, say, if that bat were to come, but it just seems that there's been no consistency whatsoever with this Indians team. And here's my thing. I would never question Tito Francona's ability to manage a baseball team, more so than myself, because obviously he's been in the game years upon years, and I'm what, a 22-year-old kid. So I'm not going to challenge him at all, ever, about anything. But I've also had this weird thought about not batting Kipnis in the leadoff position. And here's why. As a leadoff hitter, he sets the table well. But at the same time, there's been nobody to clean him up. I mean, you'd think that Brantley would do it, and he's been doing it lately, as I think his back is healing up after the All-Star break. But when you have a leadoff hitter that gets on base and does so consistently but has nobody to clean him up, then what is the point? I'd almost rather – I mean, and again, there might not be another leadoff hitter on this roster, and I think that means that Kipnis will be there. And I'm not even saying to change it, but I'm just having this thought, like, what if Kipnis didn't bat leadoff? What if he what if he batted second or third or something along those lines? Because maybe, if those guys ahead of him could get on base, then maybe he does become that big, consistent bat that drives and runs. If they're not willing to go trade for somebody, which it doesn't seem like that's going to be likely, but that could change, maybe you sacrifice that table setter and having that consistency there, and maybe this would be bad for Jason, as he really has gotten comfortable at the leadoff spot. But it's just been a thought in the back of my mind, like, what if they switched it up? Because obviously, offensively, things just don't seem to be consistent in the way that they need to be right now.
Yeah, well, and that's interesting, because so I've thought about that as well, and of course, then the question becomes who leads off, and
exactly. That's
I guess
yeah.
So this is a good segue, and I want to come back to that Kipnis piece. So probably the one hole that we can talk about tangibly right now with this team is center field consistency with Michael Bourn. Michael Bourn has been trying to get healthy, trying to get right for the 2.5 years he's been with this club, and it just hasn't clicked yet for a long period of time. Bourn not being able to bat leadoff. We can talk about the defense later, but Bourn not being able to bat leadoff has been a massive problem for this team. Could you see the Indians make a small move to perhaps get a table setter, slide Kipnis into that 2-hole, like you mentioned? And maybe a guy like Ben Revere, could that maybe getting a speedster on the bases in front of Kipnis maybe be a game, not even a subtle game changer for this team? Could it be a big deal if they could find a small deal maybe at the deadline?
That's a great question, Jim, and it's one that I'm trying to think about, because again, I think the Indians are very in speaking with Chris Antonetti yesterday. I think the Indians are open, as always. They're always open to making a deal, and maybe that's one that they would make. I think that a lot of people have been talking about Carlos Gomez, and while that seems, to be a big splash that would take a lot, I don't see that getting done. I would definitely think that they would take a look at that move. I'd also think that they maybe take a look at maybe Tyler Naquin. I mean, this year has been such a I don't know exactly what the word I'm trying to use here, but it's been so enigmatic, and there's been so much youth infused into the lineup, that maybe a guy like Naquin or Ramsey could come in and do something. But again, that really doesn't solve the leadoff spot. You bring up a good point in Revere, but I don't like to speculate on trades just because they're so arbitrary sometimes. Sometimes it's just a matter of one day, Antonetti really gets a call from somebody that he really likes, and it just happens. And I think the Indians are going to be quiet at the deadline this year. I really do. I don't think there's there's many moves to be made. But if you bring in an outfielder, I mean, there's already so many outfielders. So I would have to be a switch, and somebody would have to be willing to take on Bourne's contract, it would seem like.
Right. And I think, when you talk about and I don't want to talk about, I've spent the better part of the season talking about the roster construction. I mean, that there's such a logjam there right now with Rayburn and Murphy, and who are both playing pretty well, and Bourne and Brantley and Moss, and Swisher comes back. He can play some outfield too, and we'll talk about him as well. But you mentioned these, and that's the thing with trades and the trade deadline, especially with Cleveland. There's two things you have to keep in mind always. And you mentioned Carlos Gomez. The reality with Gomez is, while he signed through 2017, I believe, he comes with $9 million next year, $10 million a year after that. That's a lot of money for this team to take on. For the Indians to make a move like that, they've got to dump, like you said, a Michael Bourne. And why would Milwaukee dump the salary of Carlos Gomez and take on the salary of Michael Bourne?
Yeah.
You hear about a Carlos Carrasco deal, and I thought it was interesting. We aren't motivated to trade Carlos Carrasco, which I think is
or any of the starting pitchers.
Yeah, right. I mean, and why should they be? I mean, the minor league system as well as I do. It's not like there's guys pounding on the door to get into this rotation, for one. And for another, why would you trade a guy like Carrasco if Toronto called? Carrasco, who's arguably been one of the top 10 pitchers over the past year, why would you deal him for some minor league guys? It just doesn't make any sense. So when he says something like that, Hayden, he says something like, we aren't motivated to trade any of the starting pitching. I mean, he kind of used some GM speak there. What would motivate him, if anything, to deal any one of these starters?
Oh, Jim, I was thinking about this. Maybe it just speaks to my mind, but I was thinking about this last night, going to bed. Like, there is always an option. Like Carlos Carrasco is not untradeable. Corey Kluber is not untradeable. If somebody came to the door and said, here's a perfect deal, Chris, take it or leave it, he's gonna take it.
Right.
If it's a big haul, or it's something that he feels the Indians could really benefit from, then yeah, they're going to trade. Whatever Antonetti feels is best for the future of this team. If say, for instance, and I don't know the money, and I'm just going based on players here. If the Blue Jays offered Josh Donaldson and Russell, not Russell Martin. If they offer Josh Donaldson and say even like Edwin Encarnacion for Carlos Carrasco, and they said, oh well, we'll eat their contracts too. I mean, this is stupid because it would never happen. But absolutely, Antonetti would take that deal in a heartbeat. So the point is that if there's a perfect deal out there, or there's one in which the value that the Indians are receiving is way, way, way above the value that they're giving away, then it's going to happen. And that's for any player on the roster, much less the pitching staff. That being said, Antonetti will not get taken to the cleaners. He's proven this time and time again. He's not going to do anything that's not fantastic in terms of value. I mean, if there's one thing that Chris Antonetti's done, he's gotten a lot of value for the players that he's dealt for, and or dealt away, excuse me, sure. And been really, really good at that. And that's one thing that I envision will continue into this trade season.
Well, and he's not really been a massive player at the deadline either.
No.
Other than, I mean, he made the Ubaldo deal,
which ended up working out,
right?
Right. People trash Ubaldo, and he wasn't very good, in certain aspects, but he was a catalyst for that 2013 playoff run. And what have Drew Pomeranz and Alex White, and I even, excuse me for forgetting the last guy. I mean, what have they done? He obviously knew what he was getting rid of, and he knew what he was getting. And people like to trash that Ubaldo deal, but at the same time, it worked out as I mean, maybe it was just a smidge above 50% in terms of, what each team got in the deal, but the Indians won that trade.
Well, I mean, Alex White was with Colorado for I don't even know how long before he moved to Houston. I don't think he's pitching anymore. If he is, he's not effective. Pomeranz is a reliever for the A's.
Right. Who the Indians just beat,
Right.
Yeah.
Well, they beat him up too.
Yeah, exactly.
So I guess at the end of that deal, if you say, would you take, and let's, my friend Steve Urbanek is, he's a huge Ubaldo fan who's having actually a great year this year with Baltimore. But he made a really interesting statement to me about Ubaldo in that 2013 season. Those last 2 months of baseball that he pitched were arguably at the time two of the best months that he's ever seen from any starter. He was almost untouchable during that stretch.
Jason Giambi said. Giambi said that when Ubaldo was at his best, he was amongst the best pitchers in baseball. And I don't disagree with Steve or Jason Giambi in that vein.
So if you give up 4 prospects for a guy who literally carried your team to the playoffs, because if you remember, that was the year that Masterson went down, missed the whole month of September. And I remember when he went down at the beginning of September, at the end of August, I can't remember what now, I really thought this is it. It's not going to happen. And they end up winning 10 in a row. Ubaldo's lights out. Kazmir comes in and fits in pretty well. Danny Salazar comes up. All these pieces fit together. But Ubaldo is the centerpiece of that. So these deadline deals don't happen often. He made one big splash getting Ubaldo. But the thing about Ubaldo Jimenez that I think people forget about is the enticing thing about him at the time was he was under control for 2.5 years. So here's the thing about Antonetti that we have to remember. He's one of the most he's one of the smartest small market GMs in baseball. He's not going to bring in a guy that is a rental in any stretch. So I don't see them bringing in a guy for a year or a half a year. So that knocks out a bunch of guys there. And he's also, there's this interesting window coming up next year where we have some other prospects kind of popping in. So getting a center fielder like Gomez doesn't make a whole lot of sense when you have a guy like Zimmer who's probably going to come up sometime next year, if not in 2017. Why would you bring a $10 million guy when you have a $500,000 guy who's going to be coming up in the middle of, say, 2016?
Yep, you're exactly right. I mean, Bradley Zimmer, you have Tyler Naquin, you have James, you have a lot of outfield talent that's up and coming, and it just, as you said, it wouldn't make sense. Carlos Gomez seems good on the surface for this year, but you have to remember, Chris Antonetti is not only thinking about this year, and that might not be what fans want to hear, but he's thinking about 2016, 2017. That's the kind of manager he is. Or general manager, excuse me. He understands that the Indians market is not a big one, as you said, and it's one that needs to be handled with extreme care, both present and in the future. And I think he's done a great job at that. And I think that, there are a lot of people that trash the roster construction, but you have to also understand that he's working with a limited budget. He's working in a limited market, and he's got, some GMs can just go out and go from year to year and be like, try to win a championship every year. But Chris Antonetti's a guy that has to worry about, this year, the next year, the year after. And as you said, there's a lot of outfield prospects, and there's a lot of guys who could be making their way up. So to deal for a guy like Gomez just doesn't necessarily make all the sense in the world unless you specifically would trade Bradley Zimmer or Tyler Naquin or James Ramsey for him. And even then, that seems a little ludicrous to me. So again, in terms of Antonetti, he said yesterday, and I believe him wholeheartedly, he will not do the rental player thing. That's not something the Indians can afford to do. And he's going to do what makes this team better both now and in the future. And if that's nothing, so be it. That's part of the drill.
Yeah, well, and I mean, let's be honest. If Milwaukee's dealing a center fielder, if they're dealing Gomez, the first guy they're going to ask for is Bradley Zimmer. So, and
I saw something where they were going to ask for. I saw something, and I don't know where I saw it, but somebody said that they wouldn't accept the trade of Zimmer, Naquin, like Walters, and maybe even Ramirez or something. I was like, really?
Jeez.
Come on.
I mean, so you have a guy in Gomez. Hold on a second, Hayden.
Yeah,
I'll cut this out. Hey, Ava, come on.
We got puppies interrupting the pod.
Come on. Yeah, she's up on the back of my couch, sticking her head out the window, barking at people who are walking by. All right. So you have a guy in Gomez who signed through the end of 2017, and when you're talking about a prospect package as big as that they would want, I mean, this is when you start realizing that deadline deals aren't necessarily the smart way to go. I think the best deadline deals are for guys that are, in a perfect world, a guy like Mike Aviles, who they're not going to deal. I just want to put that out there. But that's the kind of player that you would, if you're not making waves and you got a guy only for the second half of the season, that's the perfect kind of trade. You get him, maybe get a bullpen arm, maybe get a young prospect. And when you're talking about deals like that, you're not talking about game-changing deals. And I think that's kind of where the Indians are right now, is they're in this position where, let's say they do decide to trade a Rayburn. What do you really get back for Ryan Rayburn? I mean, this is no offense to Rayburn, great guy, playing really well right now. But is a team really willing to sacrifice a current player on the roster that could help the Indians, or even a top prospect for Ryan Rayburn? Maybe. I mean, the Indians did trade Casey Blake for Carlos Santana. Maybe there's a deal out there, and maybe you make that deal. But like you said, I think you hit the nail on the head with this.
And Antonetti would make that deal. That's the thing.
Right. Well, see, and that's the thing. We don't know. There may be a deal that comes up like that. We've heard some rumblings about the Mets, and they're not always the smartest front office in the land. Maybe you can make a move there, but I don't know that we make a game-changing move for this year. And that's kind of where when we talk about treading water, it seems like we're treading water in a lot of different directions as well. So I'm not really concerned too much about that deadline. I guess, kind of going forward, when you look about this at this team, you talk about Ramsey, you talk about Naquin, Tyler Holt is also a popular name. You have Nick Swisher coming up. I'm assuming probably in the next 4 or 5 days, depending on how he's doing. I think he's in. Is he in Akron now?
Yeah, the last 2 days he was in Akron. He'll be in Cleveland today. Try to catch up with him a little bit, and then he'll be back in Akron for 2 more, and then we'll go from there. But I will definitely get in contact with him today when he's at the stadium.
So you've got him coming up soon. Obviously, I guess you can look at the Jesus Aguilar promotion as maybe a placeholder for Swisher.
Yeah. I think that's what I didn't even think about that until this morning, but yeah, I think that's exactly what it is. I think it's maybe a little bit of a, hey, Carlos, wake up. And I think it's also a little bit of a just a move that,
Yeah, I mean, they did this earlier in the year when Swisher was coming off the DL with Jerry Sands. They brought Sands up, and then they brought Swisher up for the same kind of thing. So hold on a second.
Dog again.
Ava.
I don't mean to take this in a different direction, but I did want to talk about Mike Aviles for a second.
Yeah, go ahead. No, we definitely need to talk about Aviles.
The thing about, a lot of people say that the Indians shouldn't be, the Indians shouldn't be talked about unfavorably because of the way that they've handled baseball this year. But here's the thing. Baseball at the end of the day is nothing but a game. And I understand that people take it very seriously, and it's my job. I take it very seriously. But at the end of the day, I'm a people person. I think that, the human spirit is more important than anything. And I just really wanted to say that I think it's absolutely admirable what the Indians have done with Mike Aviles. I think that if you spoke to him, and that's a little bit of a touchy situation in talking to him, because you want to give him the privacy that he needs with his family, but you also want to just, reach out and give your best thoughts and wishes at the same time. But I'm sure if you were to talk to him, he would be beyond thrilled that the Indians are keeping him and looking out for his best interest, because I think at the end of the day, the human element is much more important than the baseball element. And, while the Indians may be struggling right now, I think they've absolutely killed, in a good way. They've absolutely done as great a job as possible in handling this whole Mike Avila situation, and they need to be applauded for it, and they need to be recognized for it. And I think that's something that's so big. Is maybe the Indians aren't the best baseball team, but at the end of the day, they do look out for their guys, and I think that that's incredibly important. And with the Vilas, this situation is kind of doesn't have much of a precedent. And from Tito to Chris Antonetti to Mark Shapiro to the Dolans, everybody has done an incredible job in handling, what's been a very, very difficult time for not only Mike, but for his family and for the entire Indians clubhouse. And I think that just needed to be brought up and said.
Yeah, and we talked a little bit about the stories of baseball in our famous, our now famous pre-pod that's never going to get aired. But, in not saying that the Mike Avilas piece of all this is a story. Obviously the anybody who's a parent, anybody who's a son, anybody who's a daughter, anybody who's a human being, can feel for Mike Avilas what he's going through right now. And to tie this into baseball, I thought it was interesting. And this kind of goes with the story piece of it. Later that same day, they announced that they're not dealing Avilas, even though they've gotten interest. Later that same day is when the Carlos Carrasco deal was brought up, but with Toronto was interested in Carlos Carrasco. And it was funny. It kind of made me chuckle because if you remember, Hayden, at the beginning of the year, Carlos Carrasco, of course, signed that deal, that 5-year deal. I think it was a 3-year deal, 2 option years, or maybe it was a 5-year deal with 2 more options. I can't remember the deal off the top of my head, but if you remember, his agent, Carrasco's agent, was none too pleased about the deal. He signed at a lower than market rate to stay in Cleveland. And if you remember, Hayden, exactly what you're talking about is the reason why Carlos Carrasco stayed. And I think it speaks to, when people talk about this franchise, they talk about the Dolans, and I think and I'm not trying to rip on any fans here, but the non-educated fans will rip on the Dolans for their money spent. Whenever they say that, I can bring up the Michael Bourne and the Nick Swisher contracts, and of course all the contracts they've signed since, including Carrasco. You think about the relationship between Mark Shapiro, Chris Antonetti over the years. They've been together for several years. John Hart put them together. You bring Francona, who is part of that family. You have and you can probably speak to this more than I can, an on-the-field management team that seems to be very close-knit. It seems to me that probably the one strength that the Indians have had under the regime of Shapiro first, and now Chris Antonetti, and even John Hart, is that this front office and this ownership group has built this small market team as a family unit. And I know this sounds hokey to many of you who are listening to this, but when you hear things like the Avilas piece, I know plenty of teams out there right now that would have no qualms whatsoever in dealing him. I think as a, and I'm not trying to say this is a marketing piece, but I think as a franchise to be able to look at their players as more than just players, I think speaks to the kind of franchise I think that maybe going way back to Hank Peters, that perhaps Hank Peters wanted, but coming into today, you've got this triumvirate of Shapiro, Antonetti, and Francona, really good friends off the field, creating kind of this very interesting, I don't want to say clubhouse, but this very interesting culture, I think, that's very different from a lot of other organizations. And again, I'm not trying to say this is a sales piece, but I think this is a true kind of story that really needs to be told. And you actually do a good job of in several pieces that you've written. But would you not say this is an important story for this franchise going forward, that they really aren't like many other franchises out there?
It speaks to the dichotomy of the Cleveland fan, because the interesting thing about Cleveland fans, and I grew up, I know that you probably know my story, but in case those who are not listening, or who are listening, excuse me, don't. I grew up in Fort Lauderdale, the son of Midwestern parents. My mom was, of course, from Cleveland. My grandpa brainwashed me at a very young age to love sports, and he was at the 48 championship parade for the Indians, and growing up, I grew up an Indians fan in the 90s because of those great teams, watching with my mom. And my dad wasn't much of a sports fan, but he grew to love sports just because I did. And growing up in South Florida, you just see a very different kind of fan down there. It's a very casual fan. It's a fan that expects championships and expects greatness just because they live in Miami in South Florida. And when LeBron went down there, it just like awakened something in me that maybe there's something else. Maybe there's a reason that Cleveland's different and special, and I think that there is. And with that being said, I think that Cleveland has a huge dichotomy in its fandom. I think that there are two kinds of fans, and especially two kinds of Indians fans, and we were talking about this earlier. The first kind of Indians fan is a diehard fan who will love their team no matter what, and just is very positive and go Tribe, and which is great. And then there's the other fan who know or and the I love the Indians no matter what fan can be a very smart fan, but often is more just maybe a little bit of blind optimism, which is okay. I don't have I'm not going to hate on them. And then there's the other fan, the other Indians fan that's very, very knows baseball very well and is very statistical in their analysis, and rips on everything that doesn't go well. And I think you might be able to explain it better than I, but do you understand what I'm trying to say in terms of
sure. Yeah. So we were talking about this, and you have I think you branch off as you grow up as a baseball fan, where if you walked into the stadium in the 90s, you saw two different kinds of fans. You saw the people watching the game and scoring the game, and you saw people who had their books with them and were reading books while the game was taking place, who just wanted to be there. And you could probably actually point to your mom and your dad and maybe note the difference. I mean, that's probably, as you were telling that story, it was kind of interesting to me. The people scoring the game are probably the same people who were there in the 80s and the 70s when I first started going to ball games, amidst about 3,000 people. There are just these, and I'm not saying these are the analytical people, because I think these diehard fans that kind of grew up with this team in the 90s and will be Indians fans no matter what, split off from people like me. And I know there are analytical people here who are laughing right now because I'm not really that analytical, but people like me, and we talked about this, who looked at the box scores every day and projected like what their averages could be and what their home runs could be. And then so I would consider myself on that side of things, but then you also have these other analytical people. And if Tito doesn't bring the right guy in, or if there's a guy, hitting second that shouldn't be, these are the knowledgeable people that understand why there might be a different number two hitter, and why there shouldn't be a logjam in the outfield, and why there shouldn't be, they take it to that next level. And again, I don't want to speak for you. There's nothing wrong with that side of it as well. It's just two totally different takes.
Right. And again, and I think that creates this kind of battle between one or the other. There's a very, very knowledgeable, very intelligent group of Indians fans, many of whom work for some of whom work for the Everybody Hates Cleveland site and IBI, and even even in the professional. I mean, not that we're not but even in like the bigger ranks, there seems to be this, and it's kind of tough to watch sometimes, because you see these two different approaches, and you're like, I can see that one, but I can see this one too. And I, as I try to be as objective as possible, and I also try to draw the line between statistical analysis, which is good in its own and has its own merits, but there's also a very story driven or human element driven, or just the kind of the intangible stuff that also makes the game great. And I try to draw the line as best as possible for myself in between those two ways of thinking. And I think that that's what the Indians try to do as well. I think that, you have the whole diamond view thing, and Antonetti and Shapiro try to view the statistical elements of it. And there are players on the team who are very analytically driven. But at the same time, you talk about the family element, and that certainly can play a role as well. So I think that not only with the fans, but with the team and with everyone in general, it just seems to be there's two baseball thoughts and there's two baseball minds. And right now they're not merging. But when they do merge, I think that that's the goal, is that when they merge, they can create beautiful baseball. And right now it's just not happening.
Well, and when you're 5 games under 500 and you started off the year on the cover of Sports Illustrated, it's easy to have that dichotomy on several different levels. And, the Indians fan base is such a unique fan base. And I've always, growing up, my dad told me stories. It was great. He was a huge New York Yankee fan. And, my dad told me, wonderful stories about the Yankees growing up, Mickey Mantle and Joe DiMaggio and stories like that. But, the Indians, of course, you mentioned your grandfather touching upon that 48 team. If you think about the different generations of baseball fans that we have here, Hayden, you grew up in the 90s. You, of course, touched the past through your grandfather, but you grew up in the 90s, and you grew up kind of with this championship Indians team who dominates the Central and likely should have won a World Series, makes it to 2 World Series. I grew up with the 70s Indians. These Indians were, abysmal. And my dad we had season tickets, and we sat on the third base side because my dad didn't want to sit by the home dugout. And the guys that I would talk to Toby Harrah in the early 80s because I could literally yell to him on the field and he could hear me. It's just I've always been fascinated by the dichotomy of Indians fans that you see. You go to these, now we're sitting here in 2015 and you have an analytics approach, which is it's not new to baseball, but I think it's now prevalent in baseball. And you have kind of this old school approach, and you have fans from the 90s and fans from the 80s and fans from the 70s. And, we're kind of losing out on these fans of the 40s that remember the World Series. But it's just what I love about Cleveland Indians baseball. And I love that you can get on Twitter every day, and, you can get, if you look at our 2 writers at MLB.com, between Jordan and August, that's what they almost speak to the dichotomy. They're very different writers, but both very good at what they do. Just come at it from a different direction. I think what I love about Cleveland baseball, Indians baseball, it certainly isn't championships. It's kind of the interwovenness of these different kind of approaches and beliefs and backgrounds that come together. And I think you could probably say that about any team, but I think Cleveland is unique as being a former team pre-1960 that was considered a giant in baseball, to now that almost a half of a century of not being dominant. But you have this little blip in the middle of the 90s where a lot of the current generation, you and a lot of the other people who are writing about this team kind of grew up with. It's just an interesting thing to me. And we totally got off topic, but I think it's something that not a lot of people are talking about that maybe we should talk about a little bit more. I think people should embrace the uniqueness and maybe, have a listen to the other side at the very least. And I know there are dumb things said, but, in the era of social media, I think dumb things are said all the time, including myself. I say dumb things too. So I will admit my dumbness.
Just about everybody says dumb things,
Yeah. So, it is what it is. And I think the biggest piece about all of this that kind of ties it all together is the frustration of having a team that I think we all look at as being someone who should be contending right now. And I think what makes it harder is when you look at a team like Kansas City, who's constructed very much like the Indians and a market very similar. And I want to back off that. Probably the biggest issue right now with this Indians team is something that Kansas City fans can speak to. Kansas City's got this interesting team of homegrown talent built through a draft. We've struggled in that area. And I think this is where this season is difficult, because I think where we're at right now is we're at the tail end of some bad drafts. So we don't have, past Lindor, and Urshela and some of the guys that are up. We don't have a lot of guys ready. You talk about Ramsey and you talk about Naquin, and I think both of us say those guys, and we think in our brains, like, are these really the right guys to bring up? And I want to touch on that in a second. But we're really kind of a year or two away from this whole other group of players led by a guy like Bradley Zimmer, who we talked about earlier, of maybe becoming that Kansas City element, that homegrown element. Before I bring Ramsey and Naquin back into this, do you see the same thing, Hayden? You're kind of, you've been bouncing around the system a lot this summer. Do you see kind of that gap of talent starting to close, and we're going to start to see some of this drafted talent start to make their way? And of course, we've had Lindor and Urshela, but do you see some of this drafted talent maybe a year, maybe 2 years away, and then perhaps we see another window open?
Well, I haven't, to be fair, I really haven't bounced around this year too much. In the past, I've definitely bounced around. I've been just about everywhere. You speak to a good point, and I think that the gap is closing. I think that you're seeing it. I think that you're seeing, Giovanni Urshela and Francisco Lindor and Cody Anderson. These are guys that were Indians draftees, or brought up in the Indians farm system, and they're making an impact. And I think that it's only I think that's the first wave, and then you kind of have a little lull. I think that and then there's another wave coming, and it's just a matter of how long they can wait that wave out. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, there's another wave coming, and it might not be ready until, late 2016, early 2017. But can they be competitive in that time? And I think that that's what they're trying to do. I think that they're trying to be the best that they can be. They do have the young pitchers right now, but the offense is a little older, a little more experienced, and but there are guys coming. There is Bradley Zimmer. There is Eric Gonzalez. There is Ramsey. There is, there's a litany of guys. And to be honest,
the high A team and the double A team are really interesting to look at. You've got some interesting bats, and you've got some arms that are kind of creeping their way up, and you've got some even a guy like Luigi Rodriguez is a guy who has been in and out and is kind of lighting things up as a 5-tool player. But you have a lot of these interesting guys at the high A and double A level that are just above and beyond what we've seen consistently over the years. And I think it's interesting when you think about the makeup of this team and what Chris Antonetti's going to do this year, even this offseason. I don't think he wants to disrupt that. I think he understands that the foundation of any championship team is always its homegrown talent.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't think he wants to disrupt that, and I don't think he wants to disrupt what they currently have.
Correct. Which is a pretty good team. Should be anyway.
It should be. And I mean, the Indians minor league system is you hit the nail on the head. It really is fascinating. I mean, there are guys in Lynchburg that a lot of people don't know about that are really starting to come together. I mean, Nelly Rodriguez was a guy that I covered 2 years ago in Mahoning Valley, and just kind of seemed like a big burly first baseman, couldn't play defense worth a lick. And, just didn't really seem to have it all there. And all of a sudden, boom, he's starting to, tear it up, and tore it up last year. And it's going to tear it up again with Lynchburg and hit, for power, and maybe, get a little better defensively. And then you have a guy like Clint Frazier, who's a little younger and may take a little more seasoning, but he's even developing pretty well. I mean,
he's been off the charts the past month. He's been playing really well.
Yeah, I mean, people have their doubts about him, but now, now he seems to be coming around, and at the double A level, guys, I mean, that's kind of the forgotten level this year is double A Akron, because, I mean, at the beginning of the year, the outfield in Lynchburg was the big deal with Mike Pappy, with Zimmer, and with Frazier, and then.
Right.
Akron, and then in Columbus, you had the guys that we've talked about before. So there's kind of a gap, and it's kind of a weird situation. It's not like there's a full crop ever, that's going to be ready anytime soon, but they're just going to have to piece it together and try to get it to where there's a point where it all gels. And I don't know if it will, but I'm sure they're going to try their best to find a time where everybody kind of fits together and fits together well, and maybe at that time they're going to make another run if they don't already with the current roster.
Well, but the foresight of Antonetti, again, you've got, Kluber and Carrasco, the linchpins of this rotation, this 4 deep rotation, 5 if you count Cody Anderson. They're basically under control through 2021, 2022. Definitely foresight there. You have to have a solid rotation. Of course, arms are volatile, but clearly this front office sees the current window as being open from now until then. So obviously there's been some foresight into this, and, guys at, Yandy Diaz at AA is another guy to kind of keep your eye out on, so let's come back a little bit, and then I want to turn the tables and talk just a brief bit about Ohio State, but I do want to talk one more thing about Ramsey, Naquin, and Holt. And I want to bring up a point and see what you think about this. And my big concern, and I think there were at the beginning of the year, there was a lot of scuttlebutt about fans wanting Urshela up, fans wanting Lindor up, fans wanting Holt and Ramsey both up, and Naquin has kind of come into the picture as well. My concern with this is whenever you have a team, and you're kind of seeing it now with Lindor and Urshela. Obviously they bring, just by being on the field defensively, they bring this nice buzz to the team, and they really change the dynamics of the starting rotation. And I don't want to get into all that, but I think the other thing about this that you have to take into account is we're talking about rookie ball players here, and they're unless you're talking about a Mike Trout, usually you have sort of a lull, especially offensively. And right now, when you're talking about Lindor and Urshela, you're talking about defensive prevalent players. So while I hear this call for Naquin, and I hear this call for Ramsey, and I hear this call for Holt, and obviously I think plugging them into the lineup in a perfect world probably improves them immediately defensively. On an offensively challenged team, does it make sense to you, Hayden, to bring up potentially another 1 or 2 offensively challenged players who could put this offense back even further? And again, I'm not trying to say that Ramsey, Holt, and Naquin are bad offensive players. I think in the long haul, maybe all 3 of them can find their niche, either as a platoon player or as a regular. But again, keeping in mind that we have 2 rookies already in the lineup who are struggling to some extent offensively, although Lindor's been coming on strong. Wouldn't this create another hole, at least on the outside looking in, offensively?
Yes, and that's the issue. A lot of people, and we see it all the time. Why isn't Holt up? Why isn't Ramsey up? They would immediately impact the defense. But they would also, as you hit it out of the park, they would create more offensive issues. And that might not be the case. I mean, we've seen cases where rookies just tear it up right away, and then they go through their lull in their second year or whatever. But generally, you're not going to see a rookie, hit the cover off the ball right away. And for an offense, for a team that struggles the way that the Indians do offensively, I just don't think that that's what they need right now. They don't need a guy that's just learning to face major league pitching. They already have 2 of those guys in Giovanni and Francisco. Why do they need another? That was kind of my thought with Jesus Aguilar. Like, he's seen major league pitching a little bit, so maybe that's why they brought him up. But I still think that he's going to be a placeholder for Swisher when he gets back. But as you said, to bring up Tyler Naquin and to bring up Tyler Holt or even Ramsey, I mean, to get those guys through to help offensively is going to be a struggle. And I know that analytics guys love defense, and defense is great and it's huge. And the Indians have had their issues, there's no doubt. But at the same time, for a team that's struggling the way that the Indians have offensively, to me, it doesn't make a lot of sense to set them back even a little bit at this point.
Yeah, there just aren't many quote unquote championship teams that have 3 9ths, 130 or lineup rookies. And I guess that's kind of where I'm going at. I just like looking at things in different perspectives. I think you could make a case, why didn't they bring up Holt as opposed to Aguilar, even if it's for 3 or 4 games. And that's obviously a debate that you can have and probably have good points for both sides. But I think I mean, I even questioned bringing up Urshela and Lindor at the same time. You know, is that really, do you want one whole half of your defense being rookies? But I think that goes to show kind of where the front office was regarding, you know, the guys that were there prior, J Ram and Chisenhall, at least defensively, if not offensively, both were struggling with the bat. So, all right, I want to go ahead.
Before we get into Ohio State, I think that bringing up those two was huge at the same time. I think that, you know, if Gio was there for an extended period of time by himself, I think he would have gotten lost. And it's nothing against him. It's just that Francisco brings him so much comfort. And, you know, even in the clubhouse, they're sitting together playing on each other's phones, or they're out in the field. I mean, they're constantly together, and I think it's fantastic for the both of them. I really do.
Well, and, you know, the funny thing about that, and, you know, heaven forbid I bring up the 90s teams, but I'm not talking about the 90s teams on the field. I think one of the best things that I loved about watching those teams, I tried to get to the stadium as early as I could back then. And I loved sitting in the stands and watching the interaction between mainly guys like Omar Vizquel, Kenny Lofton, kind of the way they interacted with some of the other players. I'm not saying that doesn't happen on a regular basis with this current team, but I think you can talk a lot about Lindor in a lot of different ways. There's definitely an off the field kind of piece to him where there's just a difference to him. I see him as more of a throwback 90s player for this Indians team where he kind of fits that mold. I'm not trying, for those that are like lighting me up right now for comparing him to Omar Vizquel, that's not really what I'm doing. It's just this is a guy, really both of these guys, but Lindor especially loves the game of baseball, and I know a lot of them do, but you can see it. I mean, it's really hard to explain. Yeah. He's got this aura about him. You can just kind of see it. And if you haven't gotten to a game, make sure you go and watch this kid play. I mean, you know, Hayden and I were lucky enough to see him play in the minor league system where you can kind of get a lot more close to these guys, but there's just a difference about him. And people always, you know, you use the word makeup with regards to a player, and people jump all over you for it because it's such a gray area, but there's some makeup to this kid that's really hard to explain. And it's good to see him up with this club. I do want to back away from Cleveland right now, just because I've never really had an opportunity to talk Ohio State with you on an informal basis because, of course, you were working for the Lantern for the past several years, but you're now not doing that. And I do want to talk a little bit of Ohio State. We do have like 7 Ohio State readers, so I just wanted to talk a couple of things. And you've had unique perspective there, being an Ohio State student for 3 more days.
Yes.
Congratulations, by the way.
Thank you.
You know, Friday Night Lights was last night, and it's always kind of, for me, like the kickoff to the season on the field. You know, of course, with Urban Meyer, you know, the recruiting season is such a fun time, but this really kind of gets you eyes focused towards the 2015 college football season, and a couple of big things have happened, not only Friday Night Lights, but they bring in a guy, they get Nick Bosa for 2016, which I think was a matter of fact, but they, you know, a lot of scuttlebutt about Florida over maybe kind of sneaking in there and getting Nick Bosa. But I could talk about that, but really the thing I want to talk about is something that's rare, I think, in college football. And, you know, the Ohio State's probably the most interesting thing about Ohio State this year is the quarterback situation. And the 3-headed beast that everybody's been talking about has turned into a 2-headed beast. And it appears that it's been a 2-headed beast all along. Braxton Miller goes to H-back, going to return punts, is one of the most gifted athletes in college football. I don't think people realize, I think Ohio State's fan realize what kind of athlete he is. And I think it was interesting before this announcement was made, Braxton came out and said, I'm one of the best athletes in college football, kind of a hint of what's to come. This really could be an interesting year because I think we're going to see both quarterbacks playing a lot. But having Braxton Miller on the field constantly and in a game-breaking mode, this really brings a different dimension to an already talented offense, doesn't it?
Jim, this is something that is unprecedented, and I'm just so excited to see it. I mean, it's we spoke, not you and I, but you know, generally it's been talked about this whole Braxton Miller position change. And admittedly, I guess that I can kind of out myself now. Um, Braxton and I, we've shared classes or whatever, and it's been hard to watch him go through these struggles. But that being said, I think that there absolutely needed to be a place for him on the field, and for him to do this just shows I think it shows the character he has, because he had every offer in the world. He really did. He had every offer in the world to go elsewhere. He had all the enticing, people.
Big time teams too, like big time top 5 teams.
I don't want to go behind the scenes, but there were things that he could have easily done and gone, and it wouldn't have been a problem. But he chose to stick around. He chose to, stick around and sacrifice his position even. And and to be honest, I don't think he's done throwing yet. I think that there's going to be a wrinkle there in the Ohio State offense to have him maybe take on a couple throws as well. But
well, I was just talking to Mike Hattery about this a couple days ago. The past 3 seasons since Urban Meyer's come to Ohio State, I can think of pretty tangible, important plays that involved a wide receiver throwing the football. I mean, holy cow, imagine if that option is available on every play.
Yeah, the biggest play of last season, arguably, was the Evan Spencer to Michael Thomas against Alabama.
Exactly.
That's the way it goes. And imagine this for a second. And this is something that this is just crazy to think about.
I know where you're going with this. That's what scares me.
Yeah, you know exactly what I'm going to say. On the field at one time, ready for this? Cardale Jones, JT Barrett, Jalen Marshall, and Braxton Miller. Now, you could have all 4 of them on the field at the same time, and all 4 of them can throw a football and can throw a football well. And at least 2 or 3 of them can more than likely catch a football. So Urban Meyer's got to be sitting at his desk like, oh my goodness, what am I going to do with this? Like he's going to be like a kid in the candy store. But at the same time, Urban does have to trust Braxton as a receiver. I don't think he's there yet.
Sure.
I think he trusts Braxton in as an H-back, as a guy that can run the football. I think that trust is there. But a guy that can run down the field and catch passes, I don't think the trust is there yet. And it has nothing to do with Braxton. It has everything to do with the fact that, he just hasn't seen it yet. I mean, maybe, Who knows? Maybe Braxton, just can do everything, but then when it comes to the game, he just can't catch a pass. I mean, that's just how it goes. And it might be a trial by error thing. But the good news is for Ohio State that they're going to have just about outside of the first game of Virginia Tech, which I think will be maybe not difficult, but I think it'll be somewhat of a contest. I think outside of that game, they got about 9 weeks of practice until they can really get ready for their season, which is going to be Michigan State at home, Michigan, Penn State at home, and then Big Ten championship, and then the college football Final Four, because I think that's ultimately where this is heading.
Yeah, you mentioned the Virginia Tech game, which I think is, could you have asked for a better opener for Ohio State? They lose to Virginia Tech last year, and I think the biggest concern with a team as talented as this one on both sides of the football is, you win the national title, taking that step back. But here you've got this very interesting game where the only team that beat them last year is their opener. I've got to imagine that they want to make a statement day one.
Oh yeah. There's no way Urban Meyer is probably already watching that game tape and just licking his chops at a chance to beat them again, beat them for the first time, because he didn't beat them. And admittedly, I think here's the thing about the 2015, 14, whatever you want to call it, Ohio State Buckeyes. I think, and Urban Meyer will never admit this, and Urban Meyer is way too proud and way too good of a coach to admit this, but I think when Braxton Miller went down, and I don't think anybody would fault him for this, I think when Braxton Miller went down, he said, oh, crap. We're done. We don't have anything in the tank. I mean, I'm going to do everything that I can, but this is it. I mean, JT Barrett hadn't thrown a collegiate pass, and Cardale Jones is a screw up, and oh my God, like, we're screwed. I don't know what we're going to do, but we're going to be not very good this year. And I think And I think that that attitude might have helped them, actually, because I think that, maybe the players knew that they weren't expected to do much, and maybe that motivated them. And then once things did get going and it did appear as though they were going to do something, then Meyer, really pushed and became Urban Meyer again, and was the coach, the coach of the best college football coach in the country, in my opinion.
Well, what's not talked about a lot in last year's team, and obviously everybody talks about the quarterback situation. Questions on defense. Obviously, the year before they struggled defensively.
Big time,
really, really young offensive line that looked pretty bad early in the year last year. It takes coaching to get them to play. I mean, if you think about, the Big Ten championship game, you think about really that run. I mean, that offensive line was, if not the best in the nation, one of the best in the nation. And the defense, it speaks a lot to coaching. And I think everybody looks at Urban Meyer as a great recruiter who brings in a lot of talent and kind of that Nick Saban mode. But the reality is that team got coached last year.
Oh my gosh, yes. And Jim, I mean, I remember in training camp specifically, I got there August 4th, so about a year ago. I came back to Columbus from Cleveland for the year, and on August 4th for the start of training camp. And I think every single day of training camp, Urban Meyer said, "Oh, offensive line not looking good. Offensive line, needs help. We need this. We need offensive line, offensive line, offensive line." And I was just like, "Oh, well, if they don't have an offensive line, what are they going to do? I mean, Braxton's going to be running around, whatever." And then all of a sudden, you just saw. I mean, look at the offensive line last year. Darryl Baldwin was, kind of not a failure. I mean, a great kid by all accounts, a great student, a great person. But on the football field, he wasn't much. And then all of a sudden, he steps in and is a great right tackle. And I mean, a great right tackle for that football team. And then you look at center, the whole preseason. Who's going to be center? Who's going to be center? Nobody knows. Jacoby Bourne is too small. Billy Price is a freshman. Who's going to play center? We have Taylor Decker and and Pat Elflein. I mean, we don't have it. And then all of a sudden, Jacoby Bourne steps up. Billy Price moves to right guard, and all of a sudden, the offensive line is set and is very good. It's just incredible to me what Ed Warner was able to do with that group. I mean, it was unbelievable.
Well, and I think, and that's what, well, obviously the talent level is high right now. The recruiting is phenomenal, and that's to be expected from any Urban Meyer team. But I think there's an interesting, we talk about family. There's an interesting kind of, I don't know. It was a young team last year. I mean, they win the national title. It was a fairly young team last year. They didn't lose any big pieces, and there seems
questionable.
Well. But let me say this: their best pieces are probably still on the field right now.
Amen.
Defensively,
yes.
I mean, when you bring back Bosa,
Lee, yes, I think you're exactly right. Yeah.
So, and I think what you're seeing now is as they go through this recruiting season, I think what you're seeing now is these guys, they're on the field with all these young guys. Cardale, you mentioned about Cardale, and Cardale's Cardale. I think there's a lot of Manny Ramirez in him, but he's there all the time now. I mean, this is a guy who's going to see a lot of time on the field. Who's going to start? It doesn't matter.
Well, first of all, it doesn't matter. It really, really couldn't matter less, in my opinion, because both guys are more than capable of doing the job that needs to be done this year in terms of going through the schedule unscathed. There's just too much talent on that roster for any quarterback to mess it up.
Well, in 2007 Florida, I mean, Urban Meyer utilized senior Chris Leak and freshman Tim Tebow pretty well.
Here's the thing. Yeah, Chris Leak wasn't anything special before that year. He really was not at all. I mean, I watched. Growing up in Florida, I grew up, my grandfather brainwashed me as an Ohio State fan at a very early age. And but every Saturday, after the Ohio State game was on, it was Florida, it was Florida State, and it was Miami. And I grew up watching those teams a lot. And, I especially watched Florida State because my best friends growing up was a big Florida State fan, and he ended up graduating from FSU. So um, watching the Seminoles and Gators play, they weren't good. I mean, Florida State wasn't good, and neither was Florida until Urban Meyer got there, and all of a sudden, here comes big bad Chris Leak leading the way, and it was amazing to me that he was able to do anything. So I think the quarterback in college football is definitely not the position that it is in professional football, because you look at Ohio State last year, Cardale Jones was very good, don't get me wrong, but he would not have been anything without Ezekiel Elliott and the way that Ezekiel Elliott played down the stretch. Ezekiel Elliott and that offensive line down the stretch paved the way for Cardale Jones to make the throws that he was making, because teams were so scared of what Elliott could do. I mean, and
still couldn't stop him.
Exactly. And this year, it's going to be more of the same. You got to pick one. You got to try to stop the run or stop the pass. And if you stop the pass, then Ezekiel's going to run all over you. Or if you try to stop the run, then you got big bad Cardale or JT Barrett. Either way, they're going to get down the field. In Cardale, it's going to be incomplete, 70-yard touchdown. Or with JT Barrett, it's going to be 5-yard gain, 10-yard gain, 5-yard gain, 10-yard gain. It's just very different styles, but at the end of the day, they're both going to end up in the end zone.
Well, and it's not, the funny thing is now the focus is on Ezekiel Elliott, and for good reason, but he's not the only good. I mean, they have, I mean, stat-wise.
They have Curtis Samuel. They have Jalen Marshall we spoke about. They got Briante Dunn. They have Mike Weber, the freshman. There's even probably guys I'm missing that are going to make an impact.
Well, you just said, Samuel, Marshall, Dunn. Those three guys alone would start for most every D1 team in the country. I think we're in a place now, and listen, I mean, we've had some great coaches here, and you could, I don't want to mention John Cooper, but the run from Cooper to Tressel to Urban Meyer, we've had a lot of great coaches who could recruit pretty well, but Urban Meyer's really taken it to the last level. And I think one of the nice things too, where we get both Bosas, now he can step in. The interesting thing is we can almost look like his time at Florida, and heaven forbid that 07 game is kind of maybe him kind of getting ready, almost like LeBron going to Miami and then coming back to Cleveland. He kind of went to Florida to kind of get ready to come into Ohio State, because now he can recruit Florida unlike any Ohio coach in the past.
Oh, undoubtedly. And here's the thing, recruiting Florida is close to home for me because, as an Ohio State student who grew up in Fort Lauderdale, home of Joey Bosa and Nick Bosa, it's kind of I want to try to explain the Ohio State thing to people down there in Florida, because it's big. It is big, and it's a contingent that, there's a lot of retirees, but there are a lot of Ohio State people in Fort Lauderdale, and Jim Tressel did not take advantage. He really did not. There were a couple guys from South Florida or from Florida, like Santonio Holmes, and I'm trying to think, but he might not have been Tressel. But in any case, I mean, Urban understands the Florida pipeline. He understands that the three best states in the country for football, for high school football, are Texas, Florida, and Ohio. And he can recruit two of those very well. And he had Tom Herman to recruit Texas. And now I think he's got to, try to beef that up again. But Florida is, for one reason or another, be it the snowbirds or whatever, there's a huge connection to Ohio, and Urban Meyer is going to build a pipeline that Ohio State's never seen from South Florida, and it's only going to make them that much better. And, having Joey Bosa at St. Thomas and having Nick Bosa at St. Thomas, they're going to be St. Thomas guys who come from Fort Lauderdale to Ohio State. And, it's just, and even a guy like Torrance Gibson from Heritage Plantation. I mean, these are schools that I grew up playing against. These are kids that I grew up, we would play them in football and baseball and basketball. I mean, it's just crazy to me to think that these, I always thought I was the only one that even knew about Ohio State in terms of kids, but as it turns out, there is a huge contingent, and maybe that's the same in every city, but I feel like there's a special connection. Maybe it's just because I'm from there. There's a special connection with South Florida, and it's really going to pay dividends for Ohio State in the end.
Well, and it's a lot of fun. And listen, I mean, Ohio State's been a national title contender for years and years, but I think, we can both speak to this. Now, prior to Urban Meyer, it always felt like, even with some of those great teams, I mean, if you look back to when Tressel won the national title, that team wasn't supposed to win the national title that year.
No.
It always felt like, talent-wise, we were pretty talented as anybody else, but not talented as a team in Florida or a team in the SEC. We're obviously now kind of the creme de la creme of talent.
Here's the weird thing. Growing up and watching Ohio State for the time from about 2000 till now, it's always seemed like an uphill battle. If you're going to win a national title, you're going to win a national title because, you worked, everything just came together and it was perfect. And like the Troy Smith, Teddy Ginn year. I mean, that year, even though they were ranked number one, and it just seemed to me like an uphill battle. Like every week,
Yeah.
It was like, okay, next. And this year, it feels so weird just to be completely the dominant, overriding, consensus number one, consensus national championship selection. And you're right. It's all thanks to Urban Meyer and his ability to recruit, because, I mean, in years past, it was always like, oh, well, Ohio State's not as fast, or Ohio State's not as talented, or Ohio State's not. I mean, Ohio State has literally everything you can ask for. They have size, they have speed, they have talent, they have defense, they have offense, they have specialty. I mean, there is not one thing about Ohio State that you can't like. And that doesn't mean they're going to win a national championship, and that doesn't mean they're going to win every game, but that's going to mean that if they don't, it's a disappointment. And that is the weirdest part about it.
Yeah, well, especially coming from two Cleveland fans. And that's the dichotomy of Ohio sports. You got Cleveland fans who don't win championships and Ohio State fans that do. So here we go. It should be a fun ride. One last thing about Ohio State before we wrap things up. This Harbaugh-Meyer thing's going to get fun, don't you think? I mean, as a purist, an Ohio State fan from the time I was a kid, while I love stomping Michigan into the mud, it should be at least interesting on the coaching front to see these two guys interact. I mean, Harbaugh at the very least is just an interesting guy, but I have a feeling that we're just getting a tip of the iceberg of what's to come. Don't you think?
Growing up, and I hate to go back to this, I guess I'm a nostalgic person, but growing up, I was never taught to hate Michigan. And it was always a mutual. It was always a respect for 364, and then that one day a year you rooted against them. And I always had a healthy respect for Michigan. Always liked to see a great game between Ohio State and Michigan. Obviously, in the best, I would love to see Ohio State win. There were definitely times throughout my Ohio State career where I definitely thought Michigan. I wouldn't have minded Michigan winning just because I was not happy with school or whatever. With my, there were low points in my Ohio State education where I kind of was like, not happy. It wasn't that I wasn't happy, but it was just, there's some situations that made me less than happy with Ohio State. But now that I'm almost done, I'm thrilled with my education, thrilled to have experienced that, and will always be a Buckeye. And I understand the whole concept of Ohio State and the family atmosphere now. But I hated seeing Michigan down, and I hated seeing Michigan with Brady Hoke because he was just such a likable person, but just so obviously not a football coach that was ready to take over that program. But now I am so ready for some Woody versus Bo. I'm so ready for some Urban versus Jim, because I think that's what it's going to be. I think it's going to be round two. And I think it's going to be absolutely awesome. I mean, yes, Jim Harbaugh is a weird guy, but that makes it all the better, doesn't it? Doesn't it make it all the better that, he's such a character? Because Urban's a character in his own right. Urban is not, Urban is a great, he's a nice guy, but at the end of the day, he is a robot. I mean, that guy has a work ethic and just a demeanor unlike anything I've ever seen. And then you have Harbaugh, who's kind of at the other end of the other end of the spectrum, who's outgoing, who's charismatic, who's maybe less of a robot, more of just a crazy fiery guy. And it's going to be amazing to watch the two sides go at it. And I don't think Michigan will be ready to put up a real fight against Ohio State for maybe a couple of years, but it's going to happen. It's going to be awesome.
He's too good of a football coach. But I hearken back to watching Urban Meyer and Lane Kiffin go toe to toe when they were in the SEC with because Kiffin's got a big mouth. I don't think Harbaugh's that same kind of guy, but Harbaugh seems to piss off other coaches, and I almost want to see him get under Urban Meyer's skin. But in the end,
Jim, he's going to.
I know.
And how great is it going to be?
Oh,
it's going to be awesome.
Because as a fan, it's great.
Harbaugh's going to say something stupid as can be in leading up to that Michigan-Ohio State game, and Urban is going to get so angry, and it is just going to be amazing. It's going to be amazing to watch. It really is. And you can tell just with the coverage that Harbaugh's gotten, it's going to be legendary, and it's going to be awesome. You know, when I originally, when leaving high school, I went to University of Miami in Florida. And it was for a multitude of reasons. Maybe more than anything it was because I didn't want to leave home and I was scared, you know, subconsciously.
Sure.
Even though I did want to go to Ohio State from the time I was, 5 years old. I went to the University of Miami, good school, whatever. And the day that they hired Urban Meyer, I said, without knowing that I was coming to Ohio State, I said, Mom, I called my mother. I said, Mom, this is going to be fun. That's all I said. I said, this is going to be fun. And now I'm going to have my moment with you. I'm going to say, Jim, this is going to be fun.
It's going to be a lot of fun.
And we're going to watch it happen, and it's going to be great. And 4 years down the road, I'm going to say, hey, Jim, remember when I told you it was going to be fun? Did you imagine it was going to be this fun? It's going to happen. Trust me. It's going to happen.
And in the end, the Big Ten gets all the better for it. We get a lot of knocks. And I guess as Ohio State fans, we kind of get to be above it all because while the Big Ten has been hit over the years, Ohio State has kind of stayed out of it. But we've taken a hit kind of publicly for playing in a relatively bad conference over the past several years. That conference is only going to get better. You see Penn State, you see Michigan getting top 10 recruiting classes this year. So Hayden, it's going to be a lot of fun. And hopefully we can get some of these powers up and Adam, and hopefully Wisconsin can stay up there too. Michigan State. Hopefully we can get 5 or 6 teams up to the top because when Ohio State beats them, wins a national title, having played in a conference SEC compatible, I guess is the best way to say it, that will be a lot of fun.
Here's my problem. I don't see that happening, and here's why. If you have Harbaugh and Urban Meyer recruiting Ohio and Michigan and Florida and Texas, who is ever going to get anybody else?
That's a good point. Because
I think honestly, and I applaud Mark D'Antonio. He's done a fantastic job at Michigan State. I think they're done. I think after this year, you're going to see them decline pretty rapidly. And I think you're going to see Wisconsin the same thing. I just don't see it for them. I think that Michigan and Ohio State are going to dominate this conference, and I think they're going to dominate in college football the way that they had for so long. And I think that the Big Ten is going to be the Big Two, Little 13, or whatever it is for the next. I mean, maybe not the next couple of years, but come maybe 2016, 2017, it's going to be the Big Two, Little 11, and Michigan State and Penn State will vouch for that number 3 spot. I mean, that's just how I see it. But again, I could also see Penn State making a meteoric rise with Franklin, and I could see Michigan State staying above water with D'Antonio. I don't see Wisconsin doing it though. I really don't.
Well, it's one of those things where really to play in a conference where you have oxygen suckers like Ohio State and ultimately, hopefully, Michigan, you have a team. The thing I like about Franklin at Penn State is that he seems to be a guy who can create a solid football team with kind of a niche kind of system, he can bring in these kind of second tier guys. And this is really what Michigan State has done a good job with over the years, getting so 1 or 2 really good players and then finding players that fit the system. I think Franklin is your your atypical coach in that I think he can find some system guys and create a system there at Penn State with some top recruits that might be able to compete. And I don't know that to be true, but he seemed to have done that throughout his career as a head coach. So we'll see. I mean, at the end of the day, if it's just the Big Two, I'm totally content with that. And then we can worry 2 or 3 or 4 years from when you say that to me in 4 years, we can start debating on whether or not Michigan and Ohio State should be in the same side of things, because we want to play them back to back.
Here's my dream scenario. And it's something that I've literally dreamed. Maybe not literally, but I've thought about a lot. Do you imagine a conference or an independent conference that has Ohio State, Michigan, Notre Dame in it?
As we continue down this rabbit hole, I just had a conversation yesterday about this very thing. An interesting take for me. A very good friend of mine said, Notre Dame's an independent. And I, of course, did my typical, well, they should join the Big Ten. And he said, what if Ohio State decided to go independent? And we got into this conversation. And there was nothing that he said that didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. Oh gosh, there'd be so much fun there. There'd be so much.
Jim, I've been thinking about this for 3 years. Ohio State, yes, okay, they get the money thing is big, but back when Ohio State wasn't the dominant team and they were having their issues, and I thought, what harm could be done on a football side from going to independent? I mean, get away from the Big Ten stigma, be a Notre Dame type team, and you'd be so much better off. You could get away from this whole Big Ten stinks thing. I mean, obviously they obliterated that with the championship run, and that's no longer an issue. But man, if you could grab, everybody's like, oh, Notre Dame joined the Big Ten. I disagree. Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State, Michigan State, come join the independent league. Come bring Texas along with you. I mean, come join this big independent conglomerate. It would be unreal. It really.
Yeah. So props goes out to you, Damian Bowman, because we were just talking about this yesterday, not even 24 hours ago. So
was that Damian?
Yeah, it was Damian, man. Damian's a huge Notre Dame fan. So his most recent podcast.
I'm a Notre Dame fan too, by the way. Don't.
Well, I grew up in the Northeast. I grew up in the Northeast. I'm a good Catholic boy, and I think when you grow up a good Catholic boy, I think eventually you kind of like Notre Dame. And my parents
always wanted me to go to Notre Dame because I grew up a good Catholic boy. Yes.
We went through the do I want to go to Catholic school thing as a child, and I eventually ended up not going that route. But yeah, Notre Dame was always a part of my youth, and I think in my rather old 40s age, I think what's happened to me over the years is I've gotten away from my youth. I've gotten away from Notre Dame. So now when that song comes on, instead of being excited, I kind of turns my stomach a little bit. But maybe so 10 years from now, maybe we'll have the same conversation, Hayden, and see where you stand with Notre Dame.
I got a little bit to go, huh?
Yeah. Let's just it's interesting when this is what I love about Cleveland sports. You double your age and you get mine, and that's what's fun about this whole thing. I could have taught you. You could be my son.
Yeah. Maybe I'll be your writing son or your media son or something.
Yeah, there you go. Well, I guess that's a perfect way to kind of close up shop. We went longer than I thought, but I guess maybe in the back of my mind, I thought it could go this long. Hayden, it's been too long, man. I'm glad we got this out of the way, and I want to propose something to you before I close things up. We had a nice off-air conversation about Nick Swisher. I propose that sometime in the next couple of weeks, we have a Nick Swisher-centric podcast, and maybe not in the way that people think. I'd like to have a chat about Nick Swisher with you, public and on air, because I think that too often we get caught up in the statistics of things. I think there's a Nick Swisher story to be told, and I think maybe we're the podcast to tell it.
Yeah, I'd definitely be willing. I just don't know if listeners would be willing, because I think you're right. I think there's definitely, and I'm not trying to, tout Nick Swisher to be the greatest thing ever, because he's obviously been pretty subpar when it comes to his performance, and people like to hate him. But I just want to take time to talk about why people hate him, and why the vitriol, and why the bad statistics. I just really think he's an interesting case, and maybe the most interesting case, in terms of Indians free agents of all time, just because he's just brings out so much hatred, but also so much in the way of like I've only met two kinds of fans, and again, this goes back to the dichotomy. I think there's the I hate Nick Swisher, which is a large majority of Twitter and a large majority of social media, which is understandable. He hasn't played well, and he knows that, and I think everybody knows that, and he's trying. And the second part of it is, the fans, the maybe the non-social media driven fans who love Swisher, and there are a lot of guys who love Swisher. There are a lot of and maybe we should save this for the podcast, but people on opposing teams love Swisher.
Sure.
And I could tell you a couple stories, but we'll leave it for that.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Hayden, it's been absolutely positively a pleasure. Everything I expected it to be and more. Thank you so much for joining me on this podcast. And if you want to, first of all, if you're listening, you probably already follow him. But if you haven't followed Hayden yet, make sure you follow him. It's at H_Grove, I believe.
Yes, you are correct.
Check out all of his work at my former stomping grounds at Indians Baseball Insider. That's IndiansBaseballInsider.com if you want the easy way out. They're, of course, affiliated with Scout.com now. That's Indians.Scout.com. And there's a variety of different ways you can kind of get into Scout, but those are the two easiest. Make sure you check it out there. Hayden, if you, and this is kind of you probably want me to shut up now, but I'm going to go ahead and get this out of the way. If you haven't followed Hayden through the years, either his Ohio State coverage with the Lantern or his coverage of Indians baseball, Hayden is one of the up-and-comers. Make sure you follow him. If you go to IBI, you've got this kid is doing the writing, doing the legwork. He's got a lot of video coverage, everything that you possibly want to know. If you want a story behind it, Hayden's probably going to be there doing it. So make sure you follow him. Make sure you follow IBI as well. Of course, I know a lot about IBI over the years, having spent 5 years of my writing time there. It's a great site run by a pretty good guy, Tony Lastoria. Make sure you check out their podcasts and all their great content there with a lot of good friends. Hayden, it's been my pleasure.
Jim, it has been all mine, my friend.
And be on the lookout over the next couple weeks for Hayden and I talking Nick Swisher. Listen to it, even if you don't agree with it. And if you don't agree with it, let us know why, and we will counter it.
It's not even that you need to agree with it. Just listen.
Listen. I like stories.
I have listened to people bash him from every angle for the last 3 weeks, and I just think that as with everything, I was always told there's two sides to every story, and you need balance in life and in everything, and I'm a firm believer in balance, and it just that's why I listen to both sides of every scenario.
That's absolutely right, and I think when I started Everybody Hates Cleveland, I think the whole theory behind that was to get away from the statistical side of it. That's not right. To get away from, it wasn't a game story site. It was a story site. And I think, understanding the numbers and understanding the stories are what makes baseball, in my opinion, the greatest sport there is. There aren't many football stories that were told at my table. And my dad was a huge baseball or football fan as well. And I had season tickets to the Browns, just like many people do. The stories that were told at my table were about baseball players. And that's just part of the game. And we're going to tell some stories. And it's been a pleasure, Hayden.
All right, Jim. Take care, my man.
Take care.